Joining me now live is Peter Collignon, infectious diseases physician at the Australian National University. Peter, what is the likelihood that this has spread between guests and staff?
Well, some of it has obviously gone from guests to staff because the lady, the cleaner that got it, did have a UK strain, as did her spouse. And I understand there's a couple from UK that probably were the source. So it's not surprising that they've got exactly the same strain because, in fact, they gave it to each other and then across there. Whether the couple from Lebanon that have been mentioned are also exactly the same strain, I guess we'll wait to see the full genomic sequencing. But even if it is the same, I mean, people from England have gone to many places. So you'll find UK strains in people in Lebanon, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it went, directly from one person to another. I mean, you'd expect people coming back from any country, 1 or 2% of them will have an infection. And if they're coming from an area where there's a lot of people from UK that have visited, such as I presume Lebanon, then you will, get the same strain, even though it may not a direct transmission between the two. So, look, there's a lot we need to know, but in some ways, there's good news about Brisbane. There haven't been all that many cases. I mean, even though that cleaner and her spouse were in contact with lots of others, so far, it hasn't been highly transmissible. So to date, with this particular strain, it hasn't behaved differently to a lot of other strains, whether they're from the USA, from India, or, America somewhere. So, we're just going to have to wait and see, and it'll take a full 14 days so that we go through a full incubation period before we know. But so far, it hasn't been as bad as some were expecting.
Yeah, certainly that wait and see approach, as you mentioned. How worried should we be domestically? I know there were concerns that people could have potentially have travelled from Queensland to New South Wales. Should New South Wales be on high alert in particular?
Well, I think they're on alert anyway because there's these cases still in Sydney and, people travel. But we need to keep it in perspective. I mean, look at regional New South Wales with over 3 million people. Since early December, there's probably been, circulating virus in Sydney around that Avalon cluster in particular that got introduced from overseas. Yet there hasn't been any transmission into regional New South Wales that has caused ongoing transmission. There's been a few people that have gone there by plane, etc., but it hasn't caused a problem. And even when the people from Melbourne came up to Bermagui, that didn't cause any transmission there either. So, look, there's always a risk. We'll have this risk continually because while we have some people coming overseas or a lot of people coming overseas and being in quarantine hotels, you will get some leaks. We need to minimise that, but you will get leaks. But so far, Australia has been very good at controlling this with contact tracing and testing. And this situation so far has not been any different. You're behind the 8 ball a bit if it takes a while to realise there's a problem. And I think that was the issue in Avalon. I mean, it probably was circulating a week or so because it probably started at Belrose, I presume from a return travel, maybe even a airline crew, and then transmitted. And the same for the Baralla one, which was a separate one. But, they've been on top of it. And even in Adelaide, when there was that leak a couple of months ago, the contact tracing and testing was the thing that fixed that. The lockdown they did made no difference. They didn't find any more cases or prevent any more spread. And so far, that's been the case in Queensland as well. They've had very good contact tracing. All the people that should be isolated are, and it's under control. And you've got to remember this UK variant, it probably is more infectious, although we'll wait and see what happens in other countries where it's introduced. But the control is exactly the same. Most of the spread is by droplets. In other words, being close to people, particularly if they're sick and coughing. That's why we've got to keep people away who are sick until they're tested. And even when they're tested, you don't want other viruses anyway. We need to keep physical distancing. We need crowds indoors to be kept out. We need people to be outside more than inside. All those things make a lot of difference, along with, washing our hands. All of that decreases our risk. And so far, other than Melbourne, we've been very successful in winter. And there were a lot of factors with the Melbourne outbreak. Winter was one, but, contact tracing, untrained security guards, et cetera, and that we don't think will repeat it. So I think we should be optimistic that we can keep control of this and keep it to low levels. And the reality is everywhere in Australia, by having a suppression therapy, even New South Wales, they have eliminated the virus because the viruses in New South Wales now are not ones that have been hanging around since July, August and still circulating. They're new ones that have been introduced from the US and elsewhere through either airline crew or breaches through practices that were less than optimal with the Barella one. So we should be optimistic.
That's good to hear. And just finally, there are reports this morning that the government is now in talks to domestically produce a Novavax candidate. We know yesterday that there were concerns about the AstraZeneca vaccine. Do you think that this is a sign that Australia is pivoting away from AstraZeneca?
Well, no, it isn't. I mean, I think any vaccine that gives you more than 60% or 50% efficacy, when you've got risks in people like over the age of 80, if they get it, a 1 in 3 risk of death, that is worth having. Now, as vaccines get rolled out and we see what the effectiveness is in real life rather than a very well-controlled trial, we should learn. But we need lots of options on the table. So I think if we can make more vaccine here than just the AstraZeneca, you remember we were going to make the University of Queensland one here, but that had a problem with, how they were manufacturing and HIV antibodies. So that's fallen off. So there is potential to make other vaccines here. We want more options on the table because the reality is nowhere in the world do they know how these vaccines work in real life. They've had emergency approvals in Europe and the US, and it's being rolled out, but we haven't had any follow-up of that so far to see, well, is it as effective as it looks in the initial trials? Are there any rare side effects, et cetera, et cetera? So the more options we have on the table, the better. The Pfizer one, which is messenger RNA, is completely new technology. It's got to be kept at -70. That's a practical problem. And so let's look at other options and learn. But the reality is we're going to mainly have to use the AstraZeneca vaccine if we're going to do the majority of the population this year, because all the others will take a while to produce and get the safety data on them if it's not available already from, the US and Europe and other places where they're doing big phase 3 studies. The only good news about the outbreak over there, which there's none, is that it allows us to get the data more readily, because if you don't have much transmission, you can never see how effective the vaccine is. But a lot of these questions will be answered for us in Europe, in India and America.
Absolutely. Certainly by the time our rollout begins. Peter Collignon, we have to leave it there rather. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.